Welcome everyone to the author chat with Amanda Skenandore and Shana Abe. My name is Matt Johnson. I'm sort of emceeing for you. Before we begin, I just wanted to say that you can request ARCs at our booth by clicking on the sign up for a signed copy of the ARC button. That'll bring you to a collection of links, and Shana and Amanda's are right there. It's an easy sign up form, very quick. You can fill it out, and then we'll reach out about the signed books that we're going to send you. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Vida Enstrang, my colleague at Kensington, who will briefly introduce our authors.
Introductions upon introduction. So
yes.
if anyone who is attending today or watching this afterwards has a great way, we were talking before this started about how we can categorize these two books because they're both so different. They both have second in the title, but they are first place in terms of what you should be reading and putting on your TBR file, because these are both really wonderful books of historical fiction. In order of release date, I'll start with Amanda Skenandore's The Second Life of Mirielle West, which comes out at the end of July, on July 27th. So this novel is set in the 1920s, and in it, the very glamorous world of a silent film star's life abruptly comes to a brutal end when she goes to her doctor one day. She takes a break from her martini lunches and her celebrity hangouts. She goes to her doctor one day, and he diagnoses this small patch of skin on her hand as leprosy. And she's immediately carted off by a train to Carville Lepers Home in Louisiana for forced quarantine. And before reading this book, I didn't know anything about Carville, which is a real place, and America, the only lepers colony in the continental United States. So it's a fascinating book that blends fiction and real history in the Roaring 20s. And the second author we'll be talking with is Shana Abe, who's the second Mrs. Astor, is a fictionalized telling of the sweeping, beautiful romance between the richest man in the world at his time, John Jacob Astor, and really a complex but vibrant teenage socialite named Madeline Force. Now, John Jacob Astor was like 30 years older than Madeline Force when they met, and he fell in love with her, which when I first heard that, I approached the novel with a little bit of cynicism, thinking, how much of a love story can this really be? But it really is. It's one of those, it's a novel that renews your faith in the possibility of a love at first sight, because she really does an amazing job capturing this story of this connection that these two people have. And of course, it's not a spoiler. They went on they were haunted by the paparazzi, the post-Gilded Age, early 1900s paparazzi. They went on a big fancy honeymoon that they cut short and decided to return to the United States aboard the Titanic. So it's a bit of a tragic love story, although half of the couple did survive, and she goes on to tell her story. So the end of her love story is just the beginning of a new life for her in many ways. And after that rambling introduction, I don't know how to do these things, I want to turn it over to Amanda and Shana, because your novels are set 10 years apart. One's in the 1920s, one's in the 1910s, early 19-teens, and they're very different stories, very different characters, but there are moments where, they kind of like brush up against one another. So there are some interesting similarities in the themes that they explore. And I'll turn it over to you two.
Okay. Amanda, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you so much for being here today, coming to listen to our talk. Very excited to be here. Vida did an excellent job giving you sort of a recap of The Second Life of Mirielle West, my novel, but I'll add a few things. As she had mentioned, the story is about Mirielle, who is a Hollywood socialite, again, living this sort of glamorous life of champagne cocktails and glitzy parties in the hills, when suddenly she is diagnosed with leprosy, a disease for which at the time there was no cure. And she's sent hundreds of miles away to the National Leprosarium at Carville, and is faced with all of this fear, because all that she knows about leprosy at the time is what she's read in the Bible, the idea of the unclean and the cursed, or what she's seen or read in books like Ben-Hur about people who are cast out of town and whose limbs fall off and fingernails peel away from their flesh. But when she arrives at Carville, she finds something a little bit different. Certainly there are people who are affected, sickened, and disfigured by the disease, but there are also people like herself whose disease is at an early stage or have a very slow progressing type of leprosy that don't show any physical signs and symptoms at all. But collectively, they all bear the weight of the stigma that she comes to realize is just as devastating as the disease itself. And so Mirielle has this choice here, hundreds of miles from her family. She never even got to say goodbye to her children. She can either give into the despair of this disease and join those at the colony who sort of count themselves as among the living dead, or decide to work alongside the doctors and nurses who are trying to find a cure for the disease, and join this small group of other patients who are trying to create a community at Carville and a meaningful existence despite the horrors of their disease. And so that's sort of the trajectory of the story, and what she decides to do, and the trials that she goes through to do that. I'll leave to your reading, but that's sort of the basic premise of it. I will say that as an author, I'm drawn to stories and voices that are traditionally left out of the historical narrative. Like Vida, before I learned about Carville, I knew nothing about leprosy. I stumbled upon this book at my local library, this tiny little book, and that's what introduced me to Carville, the real life hospital that the story is set at. And as I was reading, that's when I began to learn. I knew nothing about its incidence in America. In my mind, leprosy was a disease of faraway places and ancient times. I knew nothing about the laws that condemned these people with the disease to lifelong quarantine. And I knew nothing about the toll the stigma took on their lives. And finally, I'll say that as I was finishing writing the novel, our own modern day pandemic broke out. And as a nurse, I found myself suddenly feeling many of the things I think that my characters were feeling, that fear and the loneliness of the sudden isolation. Even when, like myself, you're still going to the hospital every day, there is this palpable isolation that you feel. And it just gave me such perspective and hope also. I will say that the lives of these people at Carville, who they lived and they loved, and of course they struggled, but they survived. It gave me great perspective for our own modern day struggles and that hope. And that's really what I hope readers will find as well.
Definitely. That was actually one of the questions that I wanted to ask later, which was how much of your writing of the story overlapped with the current pandemic kind of rolling in. So it is very interesting that you had just finished and then we're kind of given this new perspective on it. It's just really fascinating. And then Shana, so whereas Amanda's novel, this sort of isolated celebrity is thrown into this unexpected community of this really diverse group of people. And your novel is interesting because you have this girl who's just finished going to school where she's been with all of her friends and she's lived with her sister and her family. And she's a normal upper class girl who's all of a sudden thrust into a world of celebrity where she loses her community. Like all of a sudden she's kind of isolated. So let us know what I missed in introducing your book. And also please just kind of give us an introduction to it.
Hi, everybody. I'm Shana Abe, and I am known mostly for writing romance novels, but this is not a romance. It does have romance in it, but it does not necessarily have a happy ending. It has kind of a bittersweet ending. But yes, there's definitely a huge romantic component to this book. There had to be, because here's this extremely wealthy, powerful, famous, 30 years older than she is man falling in love with this very sheltered teenage socialite who doesn't really understand what she's getting into when she loves him back. I mean, nobody really can predict where love will take you, but in this case, she did not really fathom the consequences of loving this very famous guy. But she learns very quickly, because the paparazzi just pounces on them, and they become, for their time, really the most famous, scandalous couple in the world. Well, in America at least, and then after Titanic, in the world, because people were just shocked that they were in love. He was this Knickerbocker, which is like the upper echelon, the 1%er of the 400, the elite. He was the son of the Mrs. Astor, and her background was solidly upper class, as you were saying, but she wasn't anywhere on his level, and she was definitely not prepared for what was about to slam into her, the tsunami of attention. So it was an interesting story in that, excuse me, I need more coffee. It was an interesting story in that I had to fathom her world in this way. And one of the ways I got into that is I just imagined she was very much like a young Princess Diana of her time, in that she was moving beautifully through her own little world, and then suddenly, boom, it just explodes because she's in love with somebody who's in love with her back, and they get married. I mean, nobody even wanted to marry them. They had to basically bribe this minister with a ton of money just to marry them, because nobody would do it because he was divorced. So I think I'm rambling a little bit, but that's basically the story. And it's just, I just wanted to emphasize, although the love between them was real, by all accounts, it was very real. It was also very tragically brief. They were only married for 7 months. I mean, they were a couple for a little bit longer than that, but not much. And then by the end, she's the most famous widowed mother in the world. So that ended up being her life. So that's my take on this, basically.
Well, I was reading, oh, sorry.
I'm just going to say I was lucky enough to score an advanced reader copy of the second Mrs. Astor, and I loved it. It's so delicious, actually, is the word I would describe, or rich. The setting details are not at all obtrusive, but so well drawn. Every time I was there in the story, I just had this complete perfect vision of where I was and what was happening. And as I was reading, Shana, I was wondering about the research, because so much research must have gone into writing this story.
That is an understatement. So everybody knows Titanic, right? Everybody knows the story of the Titanic, and there's a lot of information about it on the web, and there's a lot of misinformation about it. Basically, the misinformation started from the moment the news hit the mainland that Titanic had struck an iceberg. Suddenly, every newspaper wanted to report on it, but they didn't have any information to report. So they were saying, okay, it's fine. It's coming back to harbor. It'll be fine. Or no, everybody's dead. Everybody's dead. Nobody survived. And there's all this cycle of just hysteria, building and building and building. In the 4 days it took the Carpathia to get back to New York City with the people who actually did survive. So yes, when you go online and you just Google Titanic, you're going to get a billion hits. So you have to very carefully weed it out. And very fortunately for me, there are a lot of people out there who are scholars of this entire situation, the Titanic, what led up to it, the aftermath. And so a lot of people had already done the research for me. I just had to find those people, not the gossipy stuff or anything like that. But in regards to Madeline and Jack themselves, that was a little bit more difficult, because I had to basically piece together the footsteps of their courtship and their life through old newspaper columns, society columns from the New York Times, which is just this whole different kind of a rabbit hole you can fall down into, reading 1907, what was Madeline doing then? In fact, the very first mention I ever found of her in the paper was she was a child playing the bells at a Christmas concert. But then it just snowballs after that. So yes, Thank you for your thank you for your lovely question. But yes, that was fun. The research, it was very intense. It was a lot of stuff to weed through. And of course, I read your book, which I loved. It was beautiful. It was bittersweet and sad, kind of like mine too. You mentioned to me, I believe, in an email exchange that you went to Carville. That's right?
Yeah, I did. The Carville is no longer a hospital as it was, although it really, there were patients there up until 2015, I believe. So very, very recently, well over 100 years, it was operating as this hospital and treatment center for people with leprosy, which actually we call today preferentially Hansen's disease because of the stigma. But now it's owned by the Louisiana National Guard, and there's a museum there, an archive, and I was able to go and spend about 4 days there. I lodged at the infirmary in a little room there, and was able to just sort of immerse myself in not only in the documents that were there. The curator of the museum has done an incredible job gathering letters and diaries and old newspaper articles, magazines that the patients themselves had written, photographs, various artifacts. But also there was something about being there and being able to walk the spaces, and because of the disease, it's not the way that we think about it, where people's limbs just fall off, but it's actually something that affects the nerves. And so what would happen is you would lose sensation in your hands or your feet, and that could lead to injuries that would then become infected that you didn't really realize you even had because you had lost sensation. And so several people did end up losing limbs because of that, often to infection. So a lot of people were in wheelchairs. So everything was connected by these walkways. So while I was there, I could walk these walkways that the patients had walked, and I was able to stroll. They have these gigantic, beautiful oaks that dotted this one lawn where they would have picnics and parties. I was able to visit the cemetery where most of the people with Hansen's disease were buried that went to the facility. So it was this wonderful, very, very short, immersive research experience that I will certainly never forget.
Yeah. Wow. So you had like a sense of if it were me, I'm a little bit like mystical, woohoo, but if it were me, I would be like, I would try to feel the presence of the people, not like they're ghosts or anything like that, but like the resonance of their lives there, I guess. Did you have any kind of a sense of that?
That's the perfect word, resonance. I think you could stand there and feel in a way their presence, and I feel closer to them and what they would have gone through. It is a very, even today, sort of this sort of out of the way place in Louisiana, and you could get the sense of what these people drawn from all over the country would have felt being there and being so isolated in this really strange place for them.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering though, so my character Mirielle is fictional. She's a character that I made up. How was it writing you're writing about real people. What was that experience like? That
was hard. So like you, I'm used to making people up in real situations or real settings. The hardest part about writing about real people is that you have to figure out what they actually did, and then you have to write that. So that was a challenge for me a little bit. I mean, I enjoyed it, and it worked out beautifully. Like, for example, at one point, Jack and Madeline are on his yacht, the Noma, and they come across at night this shipwreck, this other yacht that just had gone over in a storm. And so they are having to rescue the people on this other sinking ship. And it's all in the papers and everything. And I was like, really? And it was just a few months before they were going to be in their own sinking ship. So I had to detail their rescue there. And I'm like, ooh, irony, I'm going to put that in the story for sure. But I think really the hardest part was, like I said, piecing together what they actually did. And then as I'm writing, especially toward the climax, it was difficult for me because I'm like, this really happened. Jack really did die, and he died terribly and sadly. And there are parts when I was literally crying when I was writing. The thing that really choked me was the dog. There's a dog in the story. I'm not going to spoil it, but there's a dog, and I'm like, no, not the dog. But yeah, so that was an interesting experience for me, and I think I've learned and grown from it. But yeah, it was a little bit of a challenge. But yeah, real people really
think
died.
that scene that you describe on the Titanic, I love the Titanic. It's such an interesting and tragic piece of our history, but so much of my conception is shaped by the movie.
Yeah, I know.
Came out, I think I was like 16 when it came out, so it was a very formative time. And that scene in the movie between the two lovers is so, thinking back now, like melodramatic. It's absolutely melodramatic what happens to them. And in your novel, it's completely different. They're parting. Oh, and it broke my heart. It was so quieter. And I wondered how, I guess in two ways. One, were you having to sort of separate what you had seen, sort of that misinformation, like the ideas that you get from movies like the Titanic, and also your decision to sort of draw their parting in that way. How did that sort of come to play as you were writing?
I followed what they did in real life. They lingered too long, and Madeline made it onto one of the very last lifeboats to leave the ship, and Jack wasn't allowed to board. One of the interesting things about Titanic is that on one side of the ship, the port side, Charles Lightoller, the second officer, wasn't letting any men on at all, because he took the women and children command to mean women and children only on the lifeboats. On the other side of the ship, the other officer was letting the men on after enough women had gone on, so because he took it to be women and children first. So basically, depending on which side of the ship you were trying to escape, meant you could live or you could die. And that's just crazy to me. That's crazy. This small little detail just killed people, changed lives, made widows. I mean, that was nuts. Sorry. Wow. I also get emotional about it still. I can tell you this. I've had this imagination. I'm like, if I am ever magically transported back in time to be on Titanic at any given moment, at any given day, I'm going to know how to get off that ship. I'm going to know which side to be on, which lifeboat to be in. I'm getting off.
Can I just say, for both of your novels, like, there were moments where I thought, I know what history says, and I really wish that we could rewrite history right now. And it was perfect that you couldn't. Like, in reading Amanda's novel, I'm thinking there is, Mirielle has been separated from her husband, separated from her very young children, and she's desperate to get better. And I'm thinking, I know for a fact there's no cure. Oops, I'm getting a call. I know for a fact there's no cure for leprosy. Like, this is, please, someone invent one now. And same thing when I'm reading the second Mrs. Astor, I'm just thinking, like, okay, I know he doesn't make it, but could he please, like, praying with the heavens? And I'm interested in hearing about how you guys could write these, these stories that ultimately are very uplifting and enjoyable reads, and really just, they're not downers, but they both, they had like these predetermined endings to them, like, kind of, there were laws to this fictional universe for sure.
It's kind of like watching Romeo and Juliet as a play or reading it, and you know it's not going to end well for either of them, but you still are like, oh, if you'd only just done this other thing instead of what you did, oh my God, no, oh yeah, you're going to die. Yeah.
I think for me, one thing that helped was knowing that so the story is set in the 1920s, fast forward 20 years, 30 years, and we do have antibiotics that can treat the disease. Today, it's entirely treated as an outpatient disease. And so that was, I think there was this little glimmer of built-in hope, but at the time, then you have to sort of divorce yourself from that, because the patients at Carville at the time, they had no glimmer that treatment was coming, and they were subjected to so many other, sometimes barbaric remedies in the hopes that it would treat the disease. Some of them I talk about in the book, like with the fever cabinets, but they did all sorts of strange injections and topical treatments that oftentimes I think just compounded their suffering, all with this hope of getting better. So I wanted at the one hand to be very, very true to that feeling of hope, but also despair. And many of the patients that were there for a long time, I mean, they had seen this drug trialed after this drug after this drug, and none of them worked. And they actually call it the miracle at Carville, when in the 1940s they did start trialing the sulfa drugs, and suddenly, genuinely, you were seeing improvements. And so part of that, I think, helped me as I was writing the story. I knew that at some point there was the happy ending, even if that was sort of outside of the bounds of the tale I was telling.
I was wondering sorry. I was wondering, Amanda, as I was reading it, I mean, I'm not going to give away the ending, but I wonder why, sorry, I wonder why you ended it the way you did. We were speaking about like Romeo and Juliet, you know how it's going to go with them, but with your book, I didn't know what was going to happen to Mirielle. I didn't know. And I really was like, oh, please be cured, please be cured. But what made you decide to go the direction you went in? And I'm not going to give it away.
I wrote one ending and then completely revised it, and then wrote this ending. So Mirielle, and I think that it's a similar theme with the second Mrs. Astor. There is, of course, Mirielle's disease that she's fighting, but she's also sort of haunted by issues that she's had with her own family, the family that she is desperate to get back to. So in a way, she's really coming to realize that she's made all of these mistakes in her previous life and wasted all of this time. And so family and the absence of family and the hurt, I think, that we cause one another within our families, that was definitely something that was in the forefront of my mind as I was writing this story. It wasn't necessarily something that I set out to write about, but just sort of really seeped into the story. And I think too, maybe a part of that was the pandemic. I was almost done with the story when it happened, but you could certainly start to feel like there were members of your family that suddenly, if you didn't live by them, you weren't going to see them for who knows how long. And so because this idea of family was so important, I knew that I had to end it moving in that direction. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about the second life of the second Mrs. Astor, I'm sorry, because I think that's something else that is really prevalent in the story, not only with her pregnancy, but also with her family, with Jack's family, his son. How did you blend all of that in? And was that sort of there from the outset, or something that sort of evolved naturally as you wrote?
It was both. I'm sorry, my dog is scratching at the door. So sorry, y'all. It was both in that, like I said, I had to follow the parameters of their actual lives. And Jack really did have a son named Vincent. And from everything I could gather, he loathed Madeline from the beginning. He was just like, in fact, after Madeline's son, Jakey, was born, Vincent basically said, that's not my father's son. I mean, he really didn't like her.
He was sorry? He was a good villain in the book.
Yes.
Like, that was palpable, his dislike.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at it from his point of view, his family just very publicly broke apart. Divorce was very scandalous then, and there were rumors that both Jack and his first wife Ava had been unfaithful to each other. And there's also rumors that their daughter wasn't Jack's daughter. So it's just a lot of bitterness and infighting and a lot of money. And, money can kind of bring out the worst in some people. But yeah, from just a purely human standpoint, I'm sure it wasn't wonderful to see his much older dad start courting a girl his age, who was going to be his stepmother. In fact, he was a year older than Madeline. So she was younger than he was, and she was his stepmother. So that was lucky for me, unlucky for them, of course, but lucky for me in terms of a dramatic standpoint. Thank answer the question? I hope I answered the question. What was the question?
No, I agree with Vida. He was such an interesting character and a villain, really. But at the same time, I felt for him. I felt for Vincent. I thought that would be so hard.
That would be tough, yeah, to see your beloved, the person you look up to maybe most in the world, really letting you down. Sorry, by kind of just going after this hot young thing, even though, you know, it was love for them. Vincent just sort of stood outside of that, union between them.
To echo what Vida had said earlier, I also, I think, approached the novel from the beginning when I knew like 30 years difference in age, sort of as a skeptic, like could they really be in love? You know, is he just this predatory older man, or, you know, is she this, I don't know, social climbing young girl? But you do this excellent job of making the reader feel like, showing the reader this is true love, this is love at first sight. And I wondered, did you from the very outset start out knowing that this would be a love story in that way, or was it the historical record that guided you in that way, saying no, they really did love each other? It
was both. I mean, in order for the book to even begin to be credible, it had to be true love. And from what I understand, you know, anecdotally, they just doted on each other. They really were infatuated with each other. And you can say, oh yeah, you know, older guy, hot young girl, but they really loved being together. They loved doing things together. They loved traveling together. They would go to the same clubs together. They really just clicked, and everybody saw that, except, you know, the papers, of course, had to sensationalize it. It didn't require much sensationalizing because it was already pretty crazy. But yeah, so that makes everything so much sadder, because she didn't have a reason to social climb. She was already wealthy and she came from a very good family. And anybody would have trepidation, I think, ascending to the scale of the Knickerbockers if you weren't already there, because they were just so mean. They were so mean to anybody who wasn't them. And that was obvious to Madeline from the beginning, from her whole life, because she would have been around these people, just not invited into their circle, into that very high upper echelon. So she didn't really have a reason to want to do this, except she fell in love. And that's what led her there, I guess. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask you, did you have to leave out anything in your story, in your research, that you wanted to put in? Because books are finite. You only get this many pages.
True, it's true. Books are very finite. There were lots of, and I wrote one draft, and then not only did the ending change, but most of the whole book changed from draft 1 to draft 2. And one of the things that I did end up leaving out was a lot of the community things that were going on at Carville. That was something that definitely surprised me as I was researching. I was like Mirielle. I had this idea that Carville would be like this terribly desolate place where people were just languishing, waiting to die. And that wasn't the case. I was startled to learn too that leprosy is not very contagious at all. Most people are naturally immune to it. You could be with someone who has Hansen's disease, and 95% of us could for an extended period of time, and we would never catch the disease. And so I think in favor of highlighting some of those things, I really wanted to show those pieces. And I became so interested in the fact that Carville wasn't like this, that there were all of these little parties that they would have. They had the Mardi Gras, which I did, include, but there were several other small little festivities that they were trying that they threw to make this sense of community. And one of my early readers were like, well, it's just like one little party after the next. And I realized like that's, then that's me moving too far, perhaps in favor of perhaps the hopeful, because you were both existed at the same time, that you had these people sort of trying to eke out a meaningful existence, but they are surrounded by people dying of a disease and other diseases, certainly malaria, pneumonia, things like that there. Sometimes, every day. And so part of that, we do that, I think, as humans, is we try to sometimes throw ourselves into the happy to try to escape what is so the sadness and the horror sometimes that is all around us. And so for me in the writing, I was trying to balance that. And so some of the interesting things like that I had to leave out to get the correct balance. Were there things
interesting though? I have to interject and say that the aspect of community, which I do think you got across, that was so fascinating, was like every other illness, leprosy didn't care what class you were from or what race you were. So you have these people who normally would, they're coming from all over the country. It's the only leprosy hospital in the US. So they're training people in from all over the country, all different kinds of backgrounds, and they're kind of thrown together into this little isolated world. I thought you got that across well. It was very fascinating.
Wonderful. It wasn't, and it is an interesting thing about Carville. You had senators and then people from very, very modest backgrounds. And an interesting thing that didn't make it so much into the story that the curator of the museum was telling me, that Carville very likely had the first integrated school in the South because it was a facility of all races and people and backgrounds, and there weren't, thankfully, that many children, and the children were schooled together. And so while the rest of the South for decades more were segregating their schools, Carville had an integrated school.
Gosh, that's so interesting.
Were there pieces, Shana, in your, because I imagine, so much about the Titanic, there must have been things that were so interesting, but that had to, be left out in service of the story.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent point. Titanic is a rabbit hole to fall down, I can tell you that. But because the story was told from Madeline's point of view, in real life, Madeline, she was 5 months pregnant then, and she was suffering from kind of that constant nausea and illness. She was struggling to eat. And people didn't see her very much. So I had to still stay faithful to that. She didn't run around the ship and do everything. Like when the ship struck the iceberg, she was asleep. Jack had to wake her up and tell her about it. So I did include quite a bit of the Titanic that I knew she would see, like the first class stuff, the promenade deck, the Turkish baths. That was a crazy thing. But yeah, there's a lot about Titanic that I learned that Madeline wouldn't have known about. So it didn't quite make it into the story. And then there's a lot of little esoteric details that I was like, that's interesting. Can I put that in somehow? Like there's a heated bathing pool down on F deck by the Turkish baths, and it was filled with salt water that was warmed up on the boat deck and flowed down all the way down to F decks, and that's how you could go swimming on Titanic if you wanted to, it was this very innovative system. And I'm like, she's probably not going to do that, but I'm gonna include it anyway. There's way too many things that you could just start adding to the story, and then you're like, oh, this isn't Madeline's point of view anymore, so I gotta knock it off.
When I was reading both of your books, but I found a lot when I was reading the second Mrs. Astor. I was Googling the whole time because I was like, oh, I gotta see this. So I was looking for pictures, anything I could find just to kind of bring another dimension to it. So I can only imagine it was just impossible to know what to leave on the cutting room floor.
That was the first thing I did when I finished. I was like, oh, I got to see what the real Mrs. Astor looked like, and the real, and then following, all of the piece. I had her after story is also so interesting too.
Yeah, I was like, what happened to her son? Like, how did he grow up? What was he like? It's totally fascinating.
Yeah, real people.
I'd like to interject here with a question from the chat from earlier. Which Shana actually echoed pretty much what you had asked Amanda a minute ago. So what did you find most fascinating or surprising about your characters? And actually the second part of this is what you had already asked, is did you have to leave something out of your book that you found particularly fascinating? So you guys already answered the second one. So what did you find most fascinating or surprising about your characters?
Or their circumstances, because
I would say for Madeline, I I don't know if I was surprised by this, but I admired her resiliency. I mean, considering where she starts, just, this quiet, pretty girl, she's not a genius, but she's intelligent, she's very attractive. People don't take her as seriously as they could. By the time she gets to Titanic, like I said, she's 5 months pregnant. She insists on going back for the survivors because, one of them may be her husband. And she herself did a lot of rowing of the boat, this pregnant woman, because she was good at it. She had experience rowing, and most of the women didn't. So she's just this tough cookie when it comes down to it. She just hangs on there, and she survives and thrives and gets out of it alive, but she helps other people get out of it alive as well. So I admire her for that.
That is true.
One of the things that surprised me as I was setting out to sort of craft my characters, again, all of whom are fictitious, but are sort of an amalgamation of real stories that I had read in memoirs and letters from patients who had been at Carville. And one of the most surprising things to me was the humor. And the main character, Mirielle, I wouldn't say is a terribly funny character, but there is another character, Frank, at the community, who's been there a really long time. Since almost right after the First World War, he has to go to the colony, and he's able to retain this great humor and optimistic sort of outlook at life. And that was definitely a surprising thing as I was reading the real stories about, the jokes that they would play on one another, or people would sneak out of the colony. They called it going through the hole in the fence. They would cut a hole literally in the barbed wire fence that surrounded the facility and sneak out. And their interactions, again, because I think there is so much to the stigma of the disease, and so much misunderstanding. Like you were mentioning all that misinformation about the Titanic. There's so much misinformation about leprosy, about Hansen's disease as well. And I really admired how the patients at Carville would sometimes sort of turn that and use that to their advantage. And in a way, it was like a shield because they were getting so much sort of oppression from the outside. And so I wanted to be sure that I brought that into one of my characters.
That's great. Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. We are getting very close to the end of this chat. And I just want to thank you both for being here.
Yes, now we can see everyone's pets.
Sorry, they just won't stop scratching at the door.
It's pet time. And so Amanda's book is a funny take on a leprosy colony. And Shana writes the romance between Jack and Madeline better than James Cameron did it in the movie Titanic. These are the two takeaways. But no, I in jest.
Very rich, amazing research behind these, and written by authors who you couldn't imagine anyone else being able to write this. I mean, Amanda has a background as a healthcare worker, so having that perspective, telling this story is just fascinating. And then with Shana's background, writing romances, it made what could have been a historical book a little dry about rich people and the Titanic, but really emotional and engaging. You guys did an amazing job on these.
Thank you.
Yes, and my last point for anyone looking for an ARC, there is a sign-up form at our Kensington booth where we'll send you an ARC, and there may be a signed copy for some select winners. So go to the booth, find the sign-up form. It's like a big button on sort of near the top, and yeah, we look forward to hearing from everyone. Thank you, everyone in the attendance who stayed and listened.
Vote library reads and vote.
Yes.
Vote.
Yeah, for those librarians and booksellers in our audience, we would very much appreciate the reads and the votes for Indie Next and library reads. Amanda and Shana, thank you so much for being here. Vita, thank you for moderating. This has been a blast. Honestly, if you guys had a podcast, I would subscribe. It was wonderful. And your books are just tremendous, truly. So.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
That was so fun. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.